περισσότερο χρόνο στη διάθεσή μας για να την παρακολουθήσουμε και να την απολαύσουμε. Λοιπόν,
περιμένετε λίγο να διάσω.
Σας παρακαλώ πολύ, καθίστε.
Περιμένετε λίγο να διάσω την κάμερα.
Τι θέλετε?
Περιμένετε λίγο να διάσω την κάμερα και να έρθω.
Αργεί εδώ.
2 λεπτά.
Να ασχοληθεί και λίγο τεχνικό με κάποια πράγματα. Περιμένουμε και το τεχνικό με την κάμερα γιατί μας καθυστερεί λίγο. Κύριε Κονταξάκη, πριν ξεκινήσουμε την ομιλία της κυρίας Μπίτνερ, θα παρακαλούσα τον πρίτανη του Πολυτεχνείου Κρήτης, τον κύριο Διαμαντόπουλο, για ένα χαιρετισμό στην εκδήλωση αυτή, μιας και δεν μπορούσε να έρθει στην αρχή της, λόγω λυμμένων υποχρεώσεων.
Just a few words in English. For a very conventional engineer like myself, with studies in chemical engineering, it is a big pleasure to come here and hear something very different. We're very proud to have our School of Architecture at the Technical University of Crete because we have the opportunity to enjoy areas of science and culture and societies that the conventional engineers in the other engineering departments cannot offer, such as social sciences, humanities, arts. So I would like to congratulate the department and all the colleagues which organized this event. And I would like to welcome Dr. Bittner to Chania. We're very eager to listen to your talk, and I hope you enjoy this day as much as we enjoy this event. Thank you.
A great thank you to the director of the Technical University and to the people that have invited me. It's a great pleasure to be in Chania and to talk about the Bauhaus and to listen to all of the Bauhaus scholars that talked in the afternoon. I enjoyed a lot. Despite the fact I do not speak Greece, one of the oldest and quite important languages in terms of the European scope. So I have to apologize that I'm speaking in English. I decided to do the talk in English rather short. So it was really in the last, whatever, 1 hour that I said, well, it's probably much easier for me and probably, hopefully also for you to follow me. If we would have had a translation from German into Greece, it would take much longer. And I'm afraid I would lose a little bit also the contact to the audience. And probably I gain a bit more time, which is also a trick beside it that allows me to, whatever, hopefully unfold also my thoughts. The talk I conceptualized before I sort of before I sort of read sort of carefully the invitation, is related to a certain extent certainly to the architecture, and this building that you have seen in the course of the day quite often I have the pleasure to work in. At the moment, as you can imagine, Germany is celebrating the 100th centenary of the Bauhaus, and due to that we have endless lines of tourists visiting the building almost every day, which is great for us. But it changes certainly also a lot the conditions and constellations of this building in Dessau. And this probably sketches out already in the very beginning that we always have to take into consideration that the building in Dessau has a very particular history when it comes to the sort of the narrations and the historiography of the Bauhaus, because to a certain extent, in a way, inscribes and embodies also the turbulences and the dramatic parts of the history in Germany of the 20th century. So we tend to think that there is from 1926, when this building has been erected, and this is from a newspaper in Dessau, a photograph that has been printed in the newspaper very much in December of 1926. And we tend to think that since this building is until nowadays back to its eternal beauty, we tend to forget that there's a long-lasting history of destruction, of ignorance, of misuse, and political sort of interpretations in various different ways, and instrumentalization in various different ways that is also part of the very materialized heritage of the building. So we always forgot that there is a very short period of time, and it has been mentioned already during the discussion of the Bauhaus in Dessau, which is about 6 years, in total a history of 14 years, but it is a tremendous echo, a tremendous resonance that lasts now almost 100 years of narratives, historiographies, perceptions and interpretations of the Bauhaus. So having the pleasure, me and my colleagues, working on that site, having also courses in the postgraduate level, inviting international students to come to us and to study in that building, organizing exhibitions, welcoming tourists. So this is a very particular sort of constellation where we always also have to remember the disruptive history of the 20th century that is very much inscribed into the building. So just briefly before I get into my talk, the building has been taken over by a National Socialist in 1933, has been used as a school for officials of the bureaucracy of the National Socialists, has been demolished in 1945, partially, at least this part of the building, the workshop wing, the most famous part of the building. Then kind of almost 15 years ignorance, political, propagandistic, sort of devaluation of the cultural, of the Bauhaus in the framework of the cultural policy of the German Democratic Republic took place. And then also thanks to the engagement of a lot of former Bauhauslers that remained in the Eastern Bloc in the GDR, and they get more and more engaged into a sort of starting to think about the renovation of the building, and also to think about how one could integrate also museum purposes in it. So in 1976, under the harsh GDR conditions, actually the first renovation took place, and from that also a new institution has been formed, and also our collection that sort of formed now almost 30,000 objects. And dates back to 1976. So it's the youngest collection, if you want to, and it's a very particular collection because it's referring to that period of time of, so to speak, Eastern Germany. So I'm saying that in the very beginning of my talk because it gives you probably also an idea how actually the different interpretations, political interpretations, and the different cultural policies of East versus the Federal Republic of Germany took place, in which the Bauhaus was conceived in a very different way. In 1960 already, the Bauhaus archive has been formed, and from that, a completely different narrative and interpretation of the Bauhaus started. So, in a way, one could even say that also Bauhaus narratives are divided were divided for a long period of time, also between the geopolitical axis of Cold War. But what I'm going to do today is rather talk about the contextual framework of this very architecture of the building. And I thought I would like to talk about build utopias. This is the first step of reflection and discussion. The second step to conceive also the Bauhaus building as a demonstration space. And the third one is about a learning environment or a built curriculum. So you might see already in these three different steps or thoughts and sort of structure might work. I'm going to reflect from different perspectives on the very architecture of the Bauhaus. And in one of the statements in the previous discussion, a lady already mentioned that we should certainly reflect the sort of the establishment, the formation of the Bauhaus in the constellation of the Weimar Republic. So, and we have also certainly to reinterpret it in the framework also of revolutions. Not only the revolution of of the October Revolution in Russia and in the Soviet Union, but certainly also the November Revolution in Germany. And I brought here these two images because it gives you probably a bit of an idea of this revolutionary past and the revolutionary context in which the Staatliche Bauhaus Weimar has been formed. So on the one hand you see the Workers' Council of the Arts. This was a leaflet spread across the streets of Berlin and not only there. A leaflet in which sort of artists came together, formed together this Workers' Council of the Arts in order to find a way to sort of move from the museums and the ateliers into the streets, into the sort of everyday political activities, and in this regard also to rethink the education of the artists, to rethink also the role of the museums. So specifically from those, and when one reads carefully the program of the Workers' Council or the November groups, you might see a lot of parallelities to the other visualization I brought into, which you have seen already today quite often, the manifesto. The woodcut of the cathedral, and a couple of talks mentioned already the role of the cathedral as a kind of a scope of idea, as a metaphor. I think it is quite important to read both together to understand what they have in common, because we could also consider the very media of the woodcut by Lionel Feininger as a piece that was also conceived as something that could be distributed on the streets. So the very idea of that media as something that should be printed and reproduced and could be spread over into the political action and activities, this is still also part of this manifesto. And this gives us an idea also of the revolutionary gesture, of the attitude, how art and life could be interwoven and intertwined again together. But it also entails the cathedral, beside its media reflection as a leaflet, what it also certainly entails is this metaphor of the Gothic. The Bauhütte, which is hard to translate into English, we've heard about it already today. This is sort of very idea of the anonymous worker, the anonymous craftsman from various different disciplines that are able together form actually this new sort of total work of art. And the anonymity meant also to sort of move beyond the traditional notion of the artist that was encapsulated and completely removed from actually the political activities, but not only from the political activities, but also from the everyday life needs. So in this regard, the Gothic became a kind of a reference when it comes to the new positioning of the artist as someone that is an agent within these revolutionary times. But the crystalline metaphor that also the cathedral articulates refers also to a couple of other discourses. And since we are here in sort of an audience that gets trained in architecture, so architectural discourses and the way how architecture has been discussed, conceived, is quite essential within certain different societal contexts. So in this regard, one has to mention also another revolutionary group, and this is the glass chain, sort of formed by Bruno Taut, and it was one would claim today it is a typical paper architecture group. So what they did, they shared with each other letters, they shared with each other drawings, and by doing so, Walter Gropius was certainly also part of that, Hans Scharoun was part of that, Paul Scherbert was part of that. So a great interesting mixture of architects and kind of authors or even poets that form together. We have to think about a new architecture made out of glass. And here the glass comes in, and you will see in my talk, glass is something that is not only the material, but also the metaphor the glass provides. And the alpine, and again the crystalline alpine Gothic cathedral glass. So this kind of chain of thoughts and metaphors is quite essential also of that new idea of a new built society made out of glass. And just to mention here Paul Scherbert, which was a German author that has written a very thick kind of poem about glass, and he envisioned in a way a future in which people used to live only in houses of glass that enables them that they all become similar. Everything is transparent, they all share the same idea. And behind it is certainly also the idea of losing weight, of losing gravity. So here also the role of the architect, not as someone like the bourgeois architect trained either at the Beaux-Arts or at the polytechnical schools, that in a way conceives also the architecture as something representative and monumental. So this was the idea of tabula rasa, of this conception, and rather than thinking about an architecture that is anonymous and has a particular sort of quality when it comes also to its dematerialization. So dematerialization is quite essential, and you have seen already in Bauhaus building there was something about it. But also part of this kind of spiritual framework or constellation is certainly also how actually abstraction from the arts and this idea of transcendence and transference jointly came together. So with publications like Vasily Kandinsky's book on the spiritual of the arts, here also ideas and thoughts has been provided to this broader discourse about architecture, and which also the thinking of actually the architecture as something that brings, so to speak, the fourth dimension of the spirituals, of the moods, of the emotions of someone into being. So this idea that someone comes out, that architecture and art is able to sort of formulate things that are not visible, things that are not graspable. This was also part of the conception, and that's why I think Kandinsky's sort of thoughts, again, landing from Boehringer, are quite important. Despite the fact that this kind of conversation of letters among architects, the glass chain I mentioned, initiated by Bruno Taut, were mainly paperwork, but they did architecture as well. So this was just a pavilion, never, it has been demolished after that, but the pavilion on the Workman exhibition in 1914, which you get again a bit sort of get an idea of these glass fantasies, this built utopia conceptions, and what is also essential within this discourse about the crystalline. There's also the other strand of thinking about organic architecture that refers to the growth of the crystalline, the growth of the mountains, the growth of plants. So this careful study of those kind of processes that are all in a way disconnected from being human are quite also important as sort of spiritual source. I mentioned it all because this is in a way the contextual framework under which the staatliche Bauhaus Weimar has been formed, and the man, only man, that sits on the left side in the atelier of Paul Klee are not at all very national persons, but rather than where they are coming from various different backgrounds. In the previous talk about photography, which I enjoyed very much, you got already an idea how constructivist discussions on photography in Russia, in Moscow, and then also the school of the Fruit de Masse were in a way even more progressive and radical than the Bauhaus. Kandinsky was one of the leading figures in this kind of constructivist sort of discourses, And so far he brought already from this sort of experiences in Soviet Union a lot of ideas back then into the institution. We see Lionel Feininger sitting on the one side as an American, Paul Klee as someone from Switzerland. And this applies not only to the Board of Masters, this international group of people, but this applies certainly also to the students that joined the school. I will talk about it later on. But what is also essential is that, and that's why I brought in, for example, the Workers' Council of the Arts, or we could also talk about actually the galleries in Berlin, by like the Storm Gallery, those kind of previous sort of institutionalized forms created something like sort of nodal points of networks. So we have to conceive the avant-garde in which the Bauhaus was part of always as a transcultural project, as a network from various different persons and organizations and institutions, instead of having a channel view, only looking into the Bauhaus. What is also part of the centenaries, sort of re-narrating the Bauhaus, is to look much more into the entanglement histories of the Bauhaus, to see it from its very beginning as a cosmopolitan project that was interwoven in various different ways, literally and conceptually, with a cosmopolitan avant-garde, and shared also with this avant-garde a very positive idea of cosmopolitanism. And this brings us back why this cosmopolitan idea was so essential, because it is certainly related to the horrible experience of World War I. This was already mentioned in discussions before, and I bring this visualization or this drawing, this sketch by Paul Citron in, because hopefully it gives you a sense of despair, of catastrophe, of sort of loss of faith, and also this deep epistemic skepticism that shaped the people that joined the early Bauhaus in 1919 in Weimar. And this is a Mazdaznan core that Johannes Itten, the inventor of the forecourse, the preliminary course in Weimar, in a way recommended to his students. So it was not only about sort of learning to work with materials, studying elementary forms and color theory, but also a very physical bodily training of how to get rid of this catastrophe bodily experience of the war. So you have to sort of take into consideration or to take notice that although the school building in Weimar was at least partially still being used as a hospital for wounded soldiers from the World War I. So the presence of the war in the conditions of Weimar Republic and in the conditions of the school was still there. And what was it about? It was really about sort of dealing with these traumatic experiences of the war in a very sort of physical exercises that went through diets, but also through the gymnastics. Beside it, Mazdaznan, sort of a kind of a course or teaching, a philosophy that Johannes Itten shared, was on the one hand sort of flirting with sort of East Asian, Indian philosophies, was kind of a link between theosophy and anthroposophy, but it was also accompanied with rather racist sort of conceptions. So sort of dividing sort of human being in various different races was also part of his teaching. So a deeply ambiguous or even problematic mode of teaching. Showing also this document gives you also an idea about when I'm saying sort of the Bauhaus as a transcultural and cosmopolitan project and agenda, then one also should look into these various different interest spheres in which teachers were lending and borrowing not only from its network partners from different avant-garde circles, but certainly also a growing interest into non-European cultural articulations. This is a publication that appeared in 1920. Itten was also participating in this book project, Utopia, Documents of the Reality, Dokumente der Wirklichkeit. And one of the pages within that book shows Ahmedabad, and a city in India, a very old, ancient city. And Gropius and his sort of teachers, his masters, were quite interested in Indian sculpture and architecture because they discovered there sort of something that was comparable to the cathedral, in which sort of sculptors, painters, architects, without names, without authorship, formed together a new idea of plasticity, of a new will of building. And so far, when he looked into those, when one looked into those sort of references in the book Utopia, one gets an idea how open-minded the scope of interest in non-European cultures was. As an outcome, one could say, when one looks into the early drawings and proposals for the first settlement in Weimar, then it is nothing to do with Bauhaus style at all, as you might immediately recognize. This is a design by Walter Determann. He designed, actually, in 1920 already a settlement, the first settlement for the Bauhaus in Weimar. So the idea that the school needs also something to live in, and this is still driven also very, very sort of spiritual ideas how actually this architecture would look like. The first project where the Bauhaus formed and joined together was the house Sommerfeld. Sommerfeld was a real estate developer in Germany, quite rich and super supportive for the Bauhaus. And this first project was about building his house in Berlin. It doesn't exist anymore, but it was one of the early approaches where all of the workshops came together, meaning all of the capacities of the school were first time brought into reality. It's made out of a shipwreck, so the wood stems from a shipwreck. That gives you also an idea of the scarcity of material, of finances in these particular times right after the war. This we have seen today already, the Haus am Horn, which was then part of the exhibition in 1923, where the first exhibition of the Bauhaus has been held. And when it comes to Build Utopia, you can certainly now question under this chapter of Build Utopia to what extent I think these utopian conceptions that they're floating, moving around, to what extent is this still visible in this particular house that's been structured with a central part, and then formed a surrounding of movements and of particular activities. And yes, it had a certain utopia in it, since it was a complete new thinking, as we have heard today already, of dwelling under the circumstances of it. It's built out of the construction kit conception that then later on Gropius quite often has applied in his architecture. And another source I certainly also have to mention when it comes to utopian architecture and its various different entanglements, this is actually the interest in the capacities that technology already offers. So the new engineering capacities, for example, looking into the skeleton constructions made out of steel in France, or here in this example of the International Architecture book by Walter Gropius, where he brought not only examples of modern European architecture in it, but also actually grain elevators, so grain silos that are nameless, meaning there is no architect behind it, but they are conceived by the modernists as brave examples of an architecture without architects, so to speak, landing from Bukowski. But this is idea that here a new will of building, a new will of architecture comes into being. And insofar it's a very interesting dialogue between buildings. On the one hand, you have this modern European architecture that is part of this picture book, and in addition to that, always in correspondence, these grain elevators that has been erected already at the turn from the 19th to the 20th century in the US. And there is a text by Gropius already in 1913 where he compared these grain elevators with Egyptian pyramids and said this kind of majesty that these buildings articulates, this is something where the will of the building comes into being and where the Europeans should learn from. So you see how many different sorts and strands and of ideas formed the discourse about a built utopia, and this is just also the exhibition about international architecture that has been held alongside the 1920 exhibition in Weimar. I'm moving on, taking the time frame into consideration to the second chapter of my talk, Demonstration Space, Demonstrationsraum in German. I'm bringing here two iconic photographs. The colleague that talked previously already about Bauhaus photography mentioned also the role of the photographic display in regard to the dissemination and communication of these Bauhaus architecture in the wider public. Actually, these two images, specifically the one on the left side, gives you also a little bit of the very idea and the effect that actually this building had when has been opened on the 4th of December in 1926. The opening of the Bauhaus in 1926 on the 4th of December, attended by 1,500 people, widely disseminated and published, and also recognized, was accompanied by 3 experimental films. And this is just an image of one of these experimental films, and it was a film about Normi, the fastest man of the world. The second one was about the growth of the crystalline, and the third one was a kind of documentation of the construction processes of the new building. And you might wonder, how are these 3 films, what do they share, what do they have in common? And it is exactly probably what actually the building wanted to how the building should be framed and how it should be perceived. It is this very idea that this architecture that is constructed out of movement, so it is very much organizing movement, and tries also to, in a way, form or sort of even bring into being the even sometimes catastrophe, disastrous, chaotic experience of the people in the 1920s when they walk through, for example, a modern metropolis like Berlin, where a lot of neons, speed, acceleration, confronts almost everybody, and how to get in order in this kind of rather disordered metropolis experiences, which is really much shaped by velocity, by speed, by overlapping, the simultaneity of things that do not belong to each other. And it seemed that this Bauhaus building, that's why it was so highly celebrated, is able to organize or to bring order into this very different, more and more abstract experience of the everyday life. And so for the astonishment about the building that specifically in the night had a moment of lightweightness, of losing gravity, of almost floating around. So this fascination with the building, in a way, sort of caused by its audience and by its visitors, was quite essential. And it was essential also part of that to bring these films in order to, in a way, frame it and to make clear on what constellation a new discourse about architecture is going on. And you see here the link to the beginning, this build in Utopia I was talking about. The building itself could be also discussed from its very different modes of displaying while walking around, where the rhythm itself and very sort of movement patterns organize the experience of architecture, but there is less time to talk about it. But there is a specific element, and we come back to the master houses since Jesus Cozziones also talked about, and some other previous speakers as well, since they are literally demonstration spaces, because this photograph of the family group who's sitting in the living room was again disseminated. So this home was conceived as a showcase for modern living and dwelling. And the couple invited sort of consciously sort of the audience in order to come in and to see how modern living should be organized. So the most of this image has been designed by the workshop of the Bauhaus, and so it was the very idea really to show the achievements of the school while visiting this house. And it had not only sort of the products of the workshops present in this space, but certainly also a lot of modern appliances for household organization. So this was also an essential part of this idea of this demonstration space. And this is just a film strip from a long documentary that has been produced aside, actually the erection of the building, and then kind of a film where people could really sort of follow up the movement patterns and the functions and the organization patterns of the house. So this is the housewife of the family group, who's very bourgeois family. Beside that, the director's house, had 242 square meters, so it was really huge. And the other master house is a bit smaller, 170. But there is certainly also a lot of ambiguities about these master houses when it comes to the housing shortage discussions in the 1920s. For example, Oskar Schlemmer, and this is a note from his diary, wrote he felt embarrassed and saw already sort of the homeless people looking at those houses by questioning how is it possible that sort of the masters live in such sort of generous sites, whereas on the other hand there is housing shortage around. So these films were sort of documenting actually the process of the house, and were also used to propagate this new sort of style of living and dwelling. When I'm talking about demonstration space, then I'm embedding that also in a particular culture of exhibiting and popularizing in the 1920s the very idea of modern architecture and modern dwelling. There were, not only in Germany, but across Europe, a lot of exhibitions, newspapers, articles, magazines, journals that shared actually propagated this very idea of modern dwelling. One of that was the quite famous exhibition in Stuttgart in 1927, where certainly also Bauhaus were engaged with, and then also not only with the architecture, but also with the interior. And what these exhibitions shared, and this is also part of this, what we would call Weimar Republic's particular demonstration or presentation culture, was the very idea that this, to popularize actually the mode topics like dwelling, topics like sanitation, topics like infrastructure, nutrition, because this was also part of the social reform agenda of the Weimar Republic, also to sort of propagate and disseminate this knowledge of these sort of very modern projects into the wider public. And the exhibitions that were organized about those kind of topics sort of shared also a particular exhibition architecture. And there is a link between this exhibition architecture and the way how architecture itself has been perceived. This is just one example, again, within this transcultural X from the sort of Soviet pavilion, 1928, at the Pressa at Cologne, also from Elisitsky, actually. And what you might detect here already, it is an exhibition, but the exhibition design moves away from sort of the traditional organization as a display along the wall, but rather than moves into the wall, into the space. So the idea that the spatial design is essential in order to organize the reading of the content. So, and that means also that sort of the body has to be brought into motion in order to read and understand actually the content, the information that is here at the display. So we have this kind of kinetic, sculptural, and sort of displays of information that sort of jump literally into the visitor's perspective in order to get engaged with him. So it's also very sort of democratic sort of idea behind it, that it should matter, it should sort of really sort of have an importance for the visitors. Some of those images we have seen before. This is a later exhibition from the Bauhaus itself. So Bauhaus did also exhibitions, participated in those exhibition culture of those times, but also made their own exhibitions with a similar gesture of displaying, where actually again the spatial design of those exhibitions were essential. It's just an image from the participation at the Kasi Fair in Leipzig, which was a fair about decorative art. And here it is this kind of interesting balance on the one hand with all of these exhibitions in those years. On the one hand, it is about sharing a lot with the trade fairs and with the huge decorative art and industrial shows of already from the turn of the century, which were a lot about seducing the visitor, sort of amusing him, creating a certain mode of amusement and joy, but at the same time also inform, educate the visitor. So this balance between seduction and education is part of this exhibition culture, this demonstration culture of the Weimar Republic, and this leads certainly also to the most famous displays you might be familiar with by Herbert Bayer later on in the show in 1930 in Paris, of the first participation, the invitation of Germans in this show in Paris, where Herbert Bayer created this famous display of Bauhaus architecture itself, and you see it again this idea of movement, of rhythm, of kind of different angles in which, so to speak, the visitor gets always engaged into the spatial constellations from various different angles and from various different perspectives. So this multi-perspectivity, multi-interpretation is a quite interesting aspect. And this is just another exhibition design done by the Bauhaus from 1931 already for the German construction trade unions in Berlin, which is again, this is organization of the ramp, also a very didactic finger that sort of shows you where to move, but also some elements in which the walls gets activated, becomes more sculptural and plastic are part of that. And now I'm coming to my last subject for today's talk and demonstration space that allows me also to talk a bit about our activities ourselves. The sort of the gebautes curriculum, so the built curriculum, or sort of the learning experiment, the learning environment of the Bauhaus building itself. What you see is a historical photograph of the preliminary space. One could claim that, and that's what also has been shown today quite often, so that's the problem when you are the last speaker for today, going back probably to that. One could conceive the Bauhaus building literally as a kind of manifestation of these kind of curriculum. So you have this stack up on each other workshops, from the metal to the from the wood to the weaving to the metal workshop. On the one side of the glass curtain wall workshop wing, on the other hand you have actually a preliminary course space. You have in the vestibule a movement that organizes actually the learning environment of the building towards the stage, and from there to the canteen into the atelier building. So it's a lot about how to organize a movement, but at the same time also sort of materialize the very idea of the teaching. We have heard today a lot about the workshop principle, which stands really sort of sets apart themselves from the traditional Beaux-Arts teaching, which was about studying nature, getting trained in ateliers, sort of studying Greek and Roman casts as sort of the role models of beauty, mainly European Western beauty, and from that imitating actually also this kind of formal canon and translate it into a sort of its own. So this radicality from which this workshop stems from were quite sort of obvious, because it was about getting engaged with them, making your hands dirty, getting engaged with the material. Teachers and learners share the same space, learning by doing. By the way, this was not as new as has often been discussed. Sort of the Bauhaus sort of brought a lot of reform pedagogic ideas that were already around on an international scope together and formed out of that this curriculum that was again changed and changed within the school's lifespan. There are not only sort of women in the weaving workshop. This is important also to mention that the openness of the school allowed also women to enter other sort of trainings and other courses. But I hope the images gives you a little bit of how actually this workshop situation was about. But what was also essential when it comes to the built curriculum, the manifestation of the architecture as a new learning environment, and this is the body of the students itself. So it is not a coincidence that when you look into the inheritance of Bauhaus photographies, that you see endless, one could say now, selfies of Bauhaus students staging themselves in the building. And this is something we have to take very carefully into consideration, because it says something how this building probably formed the skin in which such a student body could evolve, could sort of take shape, grow together. And I think this was sort of also this very idea of the school as a microcosm of societal change. And I think this is very essential to take into consideration, since we have to conceive the time frame under which it's been formed and then evolved in Dessau. It was often under attack exactly because of that students, male and female, were transgressing, for example, sort of existing gender roles. So in the newspapers in Dessau from that time you read a lot of critique and attacks against the fact that women look like men, that there's no clear sort of gender separation between the different courses, or the transgression and the ignorance of existing habits and morals from the Wilhelmine era that still shaped also the idea of teaching. So this very transgression actually of existing morals. In this regard, the building was like a scaffolding that helped actually to take shape for such a learning, such a fantastic learning environment. A building that probably offers also emancipation, and this is just a pamphlet taken from actually interviews from the Bauhaus magazine from 1928. There was a survey among students conducted already in the period of time when Hannes Meyer took over the directorship, and in these interviews they were asked, for example, what did you expect from the Bauhaus, where did you come from, what are your ideas for your further careers, and I just wanted to quote here Otti Berger, quite talented weaver, and she said, and the first question where she came from, she said, well, I came from an institution of dead conventions. Dead conventions meant Beaux-Arts school. Second, what she is sort of expecting from the Bauhaus, and she said to get rid of myself, and that meant unlearning everything that was conceived as conventions or traditional modes of thinking and making and designing. And then the third, what are her future aspirations? She said sort of based on this getting rid of myself to discover a new self and let it walk. So I think this quote, this quote gives you a bit of an idea of this emancipatory gesture. So it was not about gaining or learning professions, it was about the development of personalities that made this school so exceptional and so important. And these are only a few images of the school's parties. That's also part of that actually sort of formation of a new student's body. And jumping now into sort of the contemporary constellations, as I said in the beginning, we have the pleasure as an institution to still operating in such a building that has such a wide sort of spanned reception and interpretation and echo and resonances across the globe. So it is on the one hand a pleasure, on the other hand certainly a burden. And we are not, in comparison to other Bauhaus institutions, Weimar and Berlin, not literally only a museum. And this has to do with the turbulent history of that institution that I sketched out in the very beginning. So since 1976, when our collection has been formed, at the same time also an institution has been established that institution organized workshops as well as seminars, and it did also sort of operated more in the field of, one could say, almost a cultural center. So we had whatever concerts on the stage and programs for later on also alternative artistic productions. So it was very much a hybrid institution. And from that, when this, after the reunification, the foundation has been formed as a public foundation. The very idea was always it shouldn't be just a museum, it should also entail those additional functions. And from that also the idea of an academy department evolved. This sort of the content and the topics has changed in the course of the many years since then the foundation exists. But actually, what we do have are, as I already said in the beginning, postgraduate programs we are offering, because we are not a university, we are not sort of literally an arts academy, but we do have actually the commitment that we should, to a certain extent, get engaged with this pedagogic, experimental, progressive pedagogic heritage. As I said, in between schools as microcosm of societal change, what does this mean for today? So we, based on our own programs, together with these alumni, we organized this year, and also part of our centenary program, this festival school fundamental in the Bauhaus building, and we had three kind of premises. The first was actually, we take the building seriously and we engage with this building as a remnant, but also as a third pedagogue. What would that mean if we engage ourselves again with this built sort of pedagogic structure? And for that, we invited a so-called parliament of schools. So we had an open call for international activists, groups, alternative sort of schools that intends to renew or to rethink or to reform actually the existing modes of teaching and architecture and design. And from that, we had almost 15 international sort of enthusiasts, practitioners, theoreticians around this parliament that shared within these parliamentary discussions questions of institution building, questions of curricula, questions of educational politics. We did also had parties, yes. We did certainly also invited our previous Bauhaus lab people to sort of engage themselves within the architecture. So what they did, they created a second layer, which allowed them also on the one hand to keep distance to the building, on the other hand to create a festival structure that had always a kind of tension to the building, but also tries to weave into that history from various different layers. And this is a workshop that was about microbes, material, sort of structural thinking, conducted by Stephanie Barding. And this is another one where, as you might already see, they worked with dust and were engaged into questions of sanitation and health under contemporary conditions, caused even alarm in the building, but it didn't matter, it was essential to do something like that. And then we had certainly also a symposium that sort of discussed from various different narratives and historiographies how the Bauhaus itself resonates and echoes in various different places across the globe, from the Black Mountain College actually to the school in Japan of art and life in the 1930s, to the National Institute of Design in Ahmedabad, or to the design laboratory in the US, where we sort of were trying to connect these contemporary alternative community approaches in regard to design and architecture education, again with this heritage and what kind of dialogue this might create. And so far, my voice is also now dissolving. I thank you very much for your attention. It was a long day, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you very much. I don't know how the procedure is. Are there questions? I'm very happy to respond to them. So, if this is not the case, do you want to? I guess you will have to find a word, right? Yeah.
Αφού ευχαριστήσαμε την κυρία Bittner, να ευχαριστήσουμε όλους τους συντελεστές αυτής της προσπάθειας ή τη δέσμη εκδηλώσεων του Bauhaus και όλους εσάς βέβαια που στηρίξατε με την παρουσία σας, ομιλητές και συμμετέχοντες. Ελπίζουμε ότι απαντήθηκαν αρκετά ερωτήματα, όμως η επιτυχία θα είναι να γεννηθούν ακόμη περισσότερα από τις συζητήσεις αυτές. Και πάλι ευχαριστούμε θερμά.
So do you need a microphone?
Okay, one question. I'm not an architect. I'm a clown and puppet player. Anyway, my question was, well, in fact, the topic of the whole festival here was why Bauhaus today? So I like to believe, you know, I heard so many times the word revolution from your mouth, and I was happy about that. So for me, it's this. Why Bauhaus today? I like to believe that. So I'm going to mention a local incident. For example, street artists in this city, they are kicked out. given fines or even put to prison in the night. While at the same time, the local authorities might organize a street arts festival the following month and support supposedly the street arts. What do you think is a healthy way to deal, to bridge the gap between artists that are revolutionary and authorities?
Yeah, so this is certainly a very difficult example and also a super difficult question. Now, what I wanted to outline and to sketch out in my talk was that it is the way how we sort of think about the history and we narrate the history. This is always changing from the perspective of the present day. So we might sort of talk about the past in the 21st century super differently to whatever in the 70s, when the Bauhaus has been heavily criticized by Mr. Tom Wolfe. We have heard this also today, when it was bashed or when it was integrated as an American heritage in the 1950s in Western Germany. So it's always very interesting to look at which times what history is sort of told and what is left out from that. And it seems so that nowadays, when you look also in the way how the centenary is organized, there's also a lot of critique about it, that it lacks this kind of political attitude. But there are a lot of aspects in it, which, for example, shows also how cosmopolitan, how transcultural the Bauhaus was. We put emphasis on that because we live in an era that is shaped by cultural globality. So we have to think about also about our heritage in a very different way. And we can learn from those kind of encounters. So this is what I would say how we engage with the past. We engage with a very sort of responsible way, and we have to think about what elements of the past we bring into the present and how do we have to talk about it. And I think that it is now so burning, for example, with the question of the education in design and architecture. This was for us a very important moment to say, well, we have this building here, we have this heritage here, and how we can connect it, what kind of debates we can start. And then it's more about dialogues, conversations to stimulate those kind of meetings than claiming as this is the only place, because it's happening worldwide. And we could just offer a platform, we could offer a framework in which those moments can happen. Also because of our hybrid institutional sort of constellations we have that enables us to do something like that. And we hope that we also, after the centenary, we have survived and can sort of continue on such a path. Yeah. And so far, I mean, when I'm bringing the word revolution, and it's then more about to rephrase it as a very international, as a very political sort of a moment in history, how we should remember it. This is the way how we should remember it. Okay, other questions?